I had always loved the idea of road trips, the thought of driving through endless stretches of highway, exploring new places, and creating memories along the way. My friend Mark and I decided to embark on a cross-country journey that summer, aiming to visit all the major landmarks and hidden gems we could find. Little did we know that our adventure would take a dark turn. It was late one evening when we found ourselves driving through a desolate part of the country. The sun had set hours ago, and the only light came from our headlights and the occasional flicker of distant towns. We had been driving for hours without seeing another car, and fatigue was beginning to set in. Mark suggested we pull over at the next rest stop to stretch our legs and take a break. We spotted a sign for a rest stop up ahead and decided to pull in. The rest stop was eerily deserted, with only a few dim lights illuminating the area. It had an old, worn-out look to it, as if it hadn't been maintained in years. Despite the creepy atmosphere, we were too tired to care and parked the car. As we stepped out, the silence was deafening. No crickets, no wind rustling through the trees, nothing. Just an oppressive stillness that sent chills down my spine. We walked over to a picnic table and sat down, trying to shake off the unease. Mark started talking about our next destination, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting around, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. After a few minutes, I decided to head to the restroom. The building was a short walk from the parking lot, and as I approached, I noticed how run down it looked. The paint was peeling, the windows were dirty, and the door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The inside was no better, with flickering fluorescent lights and a musty smell that made me want to gag. I quickly did my business and washed my hands, eager to get back to the car. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, but the whispering stopped. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just my imagination, and hurried back outside. Mark was still sitting at the picnic table, staring off into the distance. I told him about the whispering, and he laughed it off, saying I was just paranoid. We decided it was time to hit the road again and made our way back to the car. As we drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. A few miles down the road, Mark suddenly slammed on the brakes. I looked up and saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by shadows. Mark honked the horn, but she didn't move. We sat there, frozen in fear, unsure of what to do. After what felt like an eternity, the woman slowly turned and walked off into the darkness. We didn't wait to see where she went. Mark floored the gas pedal, and we sped off. Our hearts were racing, and we kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her following us. We drove for hours, not daring to stop until we reached a well-lit gas station in a small town. We stumbled out of the car, our bodies trembling with fear. We told the attendant what had happened, but he just shrugged and said we were lucky. He told us that stretch of highway was known for strange occurrences, and that we weren't the first to encounter the mysterious woman. We spent the rest of the trip on edge, constantly looking over our shoulders and avoiding deserted rest stops. The encounter had shaken us to our core, and we couldn't wait to get home. When we finally returned, we vowed never to speak of that night again. But the memory of the haunted rest stop still lingers, a dark cloud over what should have been a fun adventure. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about the woman in the road and wondering what would have happened if we had stayed at the rest stop a little longer. It's a mystery that will haunt me forever. The desolate motel road trips had always been my escape, a way to leave behind the monotony of everyday life and immerse myself in new experiences. This particular trip was supposed to be no different. My destination was a national park several states away, and I had planned my route meticulously. However, as fate would have it, a series of detours and miscalculations led me to a remote, desolate stretch of road late one evening. The sun had set, and darkness enveloped the landscape, making it difficult to see much beyond the reach of my headlights. I had been driving for hours and was in desperate need of a place to rest. That's when I saw it. A flickering neon sign for a motel just off the highway. Relieved, I turned onto the narrow gravel road leading to it. The motel looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the building itself seemed to sag under the weight of time. But exhaustion trumped caution, and I parked my car and went inside to check in. The lobby was dimly lit and had a musty smell that hinted at years of neglect. An old man with a grizzled beard sat behind the counter, barely acknowledging my presence as he handed me a key. Room 13. I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony as I made my way down the creaky corridor. The room was small and sparsely furnished, but at that moment, it felt like a sanctuary. I tossed my bag on the bed, locked the door, and collapsed onto the mattress, too tired to care about anything else. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of knocking. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder and more insistent. Groggy and disoriented, I checked the time. 3:13 a.m. I called out, asking who it was, but there was no response. The knocking continued, echoing through the otherwise silent night. Reluctantly, I got out of bed and approached the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. I opened the door a crack, my heart pounding in my chest, but the corridor was empty. I shrugged it off, blaming it on my imagination, and went back to bed. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, the knocking started again. This time it was more urgent, almost desperate. I jumped up, adrenaline surging through my veins, and flung the door open. Still, no one was there. Frustrated and slightly unnerved, I decided to investigate. I walked down the hall, checking each door, but they were all locked, and there was no sign of anyone. Returning to my room, I noticed something strange. The mirror above the dresser was fogged up, as if someone had been breathing on it. I wiped it clean, trying to dismiss the growing unease, but my reflection looked back at me with an expression of fear that mirrored my own. I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. But sleep eluded me, and I found myself listening intently for any sound, any sign of what was causing the disturbance. Hours passed and the knocking eventually ceased, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the first light of dawn crept through the threadbare curtains, I decided it was time to leave. I packed my bag hastily and headed to the lobby to check out. The old man was still there, his eyes following me as I approached the counter. I mentioned the knocking, hoping for some explanation, but he just shrugged and muttered something about old buildings making noises. I left the motel, relieved to be back on the open road. But the unease lingered, casting a shadow over the remainder of my trip. I couldn't stop thinking about the knocking and the fogged mirror. Something about that night felt profoundly wrong. Weeks later, I stumbled upon an article about the motel. It had a dark history, a place where strange occurrences were not uncommon. Guests had reported similar experiences, knocking in the middle of the night, mirrors fogging up, and the feeling of being watched. Some even claimed to have seen apparitions. The knowledge that I wasn't alone in my experience was both comforting and disturbing. The road trip that was supposed to be an escape had instead left me with a haunting memory. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the knocking, echoing in the silence of that desolate motel. One summer, my friends and I decided to take a road trip across the country. We planned to visit national parks, big cities, and small towns along the way. Little did we know that this trip would change our lives forever. We were driving through the Midwest, enjoying the vast expanses of farmland and open sky. The sun was setting, casting a beautiful orange and pink glow over the landscape. As we drove down a long, lonely stretch of highway, we saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a young woman, and she looked like she was in trouble. We pulled over and rolled down the window. The woman approached the car and asked if she could get a ride to the nearest town. She looked tired and scared, and we couldn't just leave her there. so we agreed to give her a lift. She climbed into the back seat and introduced herself as Emily. She told us that her car had broken down and she had been walking for miles. She seemed grateful for the ride and thanked us repeatedly. As we drove, we tried to make conversation, but Emily was quiet and didn't say much. As the night grew darker, the mood in the car became more tense. There was something about Emily that made us all uneasy. She kept glancing out the window, and I noticed that she had a strange, haunted look in her eyes. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. After about an hour of driving, we reached a small town. We pulled up to a gas station and told Emily that this was as far as we could take her. She thanked us again and got out of the car. We watched her walk away, and then we drove off, feeling relieved to be on our own again. A few miles down the road, we realized that Emily had left her backpack in the back seat. We decided to turn around and take it back to her. When we reached the gas station, Emily was nowhere to be found. We asked the attendant if he had seen her, but he said that no one had been there in hours. We drove around the town, looking for any sign of Emily, but she had disappeared. We even went to the police station to report her missing, but they told us that there had been no reports of a broken-down car or a missing person matching her description. Feeling unnerved, we decided to continue our journey, but the encounter with Emily stayed with us. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As we drove through the night, we kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see her standing by the side of the road again. A few days later, we were staying at a motel in another state. I was in the lobby reading a newspaper when I saw a headline that made my blood run cold. It was about a young woman named Emily who had gone missing from a town not far from where we had picked up our hitchhiker. The article said that she had been missing for several weeks and that her family was desperate for any information about her whereabouts. I showed the article to my friends, and we were all in shock. We couldn't believe that the Emily we had met was the same person who had been missing for weeks. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just a coincidence, but deep down, we knew that something strange and unexplainable had happened. We never spoke about the incident again, but the memory of that night stayed with us. The haunted look in Emily's eyes, her sudden disappearance, and the eerie feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. It was a road trip we would never forget, and it left us with more questions than answers.